The harvest moon hung low over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the fields where Georgia Donovan worked. Her calloused hands gripped the plow with practiced strength, shoulders straining against the unyielding earth. In the fading light, with her brother's hat pulled low and his oversized clothes hanging on her frame, she could almost believe her own deception. 4 months had passed since Thomas's body was lowered into the hard Montana soil. 4 months of wearing his clothes, speaking in a deeper voice, and signing his name to documents. 4 months of living a lie that kept the Donovan homestead from being carved up and sold to the highest bidder. Women can't own property without a husband in these parts, Miss Donovan. Judge Wilson had told her, his eyes not unkind, but his words unyielding as iron. Your brother's land will be auctioned unless you marry within the month. Georgia had nodded politely, walked out of his office, and made her decision before she'd even reached the end of the street. Thomas had no wife, no children. Their parents were long dead. She was all that remained of the Donovans, and she'd be damned if she'd let their land slip away because of some law written by men who'd never worked a day in the dirt. So Thomas Donovan miraculously recovered from the fever that had been expected to take his life, while Georgia Donovan conveniently departed to care for a sick aunt back east. Only old Doc Miller knew the truth, and he'd taken that secret to his grave 2 months past. The deception was easier than she'd expected. Georgia had worked the land alongside her brother since childhood. She knew every tree, every fence post, every moody inch of soil on their 80 acres. She could mend harnesses, birth calves, and haggle for fair prices at market. The rough clothes chafed her skin, but less than the bitter taste of helplessness that had threatened to choke her at the judge's words. As Georgia turned the plow at the field's edge, she spotted a cloud of dust rising from the road that led to Visitors were rare at the Donovan place, especially as the day waned. She squinted against the setting sun, watching as a fine black carriage came into view. Town business meant town clothes. Georgia abandoned the plow and strode quickly to the barn, retrieving her brother's coat and making sure her hair was securely pinned beneath his hat. The carriage stopped at the edge of the yard, its polished wood and brass fittings incongruous against the weathered planks of the Donovan homestead. The driver, stiff-backed and expressionless, opened the door, and a tall figure emerged. Landon Pierce. Georgia recognized him immediately, though they'd never spoken. The wealthiest landowner in the territory, with holdings that stretched across 3 counties. His tailored suit and gleaming boots spoke of Eastern money, old money, the kind that bought influence with territorial officials and railroad-like. Pierce was known for acquiring struggling homesteads, especially those owned by widows or the elderly easy targets who couldn't refuse his offers, however meager. What business could he possibly have at the Donovan farm? She pulled the hat lower and strode forward, adopting the loose-limbed gait practiced for months. Evening, she called, her voice deliberately roughened. Thomas Donovan, something I can help you with? Landon Pierce turned, and Georgia felt a jolt of alarm. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35. With a clean-shaven face and sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to look straight through her disguise. Those eyes narrowed slightly as they drifted from her face to her shoulders, then down to her hands. Mr. Donovan, he said, his voice cultured but not soft. Landon Pierce. I believe Judge Wilson mentioned I might be calling. He extended a gloved hand. Georgia took it, conscious of her own rough palm against the fine leather of his glove. Can't say he did. Been busy with the harvest. Pierce's grip tightened fractionally before he released her hand. I see. Well, I won't take up much of your time. I'm acquiring land in this valley for a new venture. Your property adjoins the creek, which makes it particularly valuable to me. I'm prepared to offer a fair price. More than fair, in fact. Georgia felt ice form in her stomach. This was what she'd feared. Since Thomas's death, someone powerful coming to take everything they'd built. Not interested in selling, she said flatly. This land's been in my family for 3 generations. Pierce smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Everyone has their price, Mr. Donovan. Even those with sentimental attachments. His gaze flicked to her hands again, lingering on fingers too slender for a man who'd worked the land all his life. Not me, Georgia replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Now, if you'll excuse me, daylight's wasting, and that field won't plow itself. Pierce seemed unperturbed by the dismissal. He glanced around the farm, taking in the sagging fence, the worn barn doors, the endless work that waited for too few hands. I'll be in town until the end of the month. I suggest you consider my offer, Mr. Donovan. He placed a slight emphasis on the name that sent another chill through George's body. As he turned to go, he paused. By the way, how is your sister faring, Georgia, isn't it? Judge Wilson mentioned she'd gone east. She's well enough, Georgia managed, her mouth suddenly dry. Sends her regards. Does she indeed? Pierce's smile was knowing now. Please give her mine when next you write. Good evening, Mr. Donovan. Georgia stood motionless in the yard, long after the carriage had disappeared down the road, dust settling in its wake. The encounter left her shaken, not just by Pierce's interest in their land, but by the uncomfortable sensation that he'd seen through her, disguised with unsettling ease. That night, sleep eluded her. She paced the small cabin, Thomas's boots heavy on her feet, his watch ticking in her pocket. Her brother had died protecting this land from rustlers. What would he think of her deception? What would he tell her to do now? Whatever it takes, Georgie, she could almost hear him say. Whatever it takes to keep what's ours. But as dawn broke over the eastern hills, Georgia Donovan knew with grim certainty that Landon Pierce would be back. And next time, he wouldn't be satisfied with polite refusals. Men like Pierce didn't accept no from other men, let alone from women pretending to be men. She would need to be stronger, more convincing, or find another way to protect the only home she... 3 days passed with no sign of Pierce or his fancy carriage. Georgia threw herself into the work of the farm, driving her body past exhaustion in hopes of dreamless sleep. Each morning, she scanned the horizon for dust clouds, and each evening she checked that Thomas's shotgun was loaded and within reach. But on the 4th day, she ventured into town for supplies. It was always a risk. The longer she spoke with people who had known her brother, the more likely someone would notice differences in her speech or mannerisms. But coffee and flour wouldn't buy themselves, and isolation bred its own. Willow Creek was barely more than a wide spot in the road: a general store, a saloon, a small church, and the territorial land office that doubled as Judge Wilson's courthouse. As Georgia tied her horse outside the general store, she spotted Pierce's carriage outside the saloon. Her first instinct was to complete her business quickly and leave. But knowledge was a weapon she couldn't afford to overlook. She entered the store, nodding curtly to Mrs. Abernathy behind the... Morning, ma'am. Need flour, coffee, and some of that chewing tobacco. She never actually used the tobacco, but it added authenticity to her disguise. Mrs. Abernathy smiled warmly. Good morning, Thomas. How's that north field coming along? Slowly, Georgia replied, mimicking her brother's laconic manner. But it'll yield. As Mrs. Abernathy gathered her supplies, Georgia casually asked, saw Pierce's carriage outside the saloon. He'd been in town long. The shopkeeper's expression shifted subtly. Nearly a week now. Been buying up land all over the valley. The Jenkins place, Old Man Harrigan's sheep pasture, even the Miller property after the doctor passed. She lowered her voice. They say he's working with the railroad, planning a new spur line. Anyone who sells now will make a fortune when the tracks come through. Georgia's pulse. If Pierce was working with the railroad, that explained his interest in their creekside property. Water access was essential for steam engines. He make you an offer yet? She asked, keeping her tone neutral. Oh my, yes, Mrs. Abernathy sighed. More money than Walter and I have seen in 20 years of selling calico and coffee. But this store was my father's, and his father's before him. Some things aren't for sale. Georgia felt a rush of gratitude for the woman's stubborn loyalty to her heritage. Seems we think alike on that score, Mrs. Abernathy. The bell above the door jingled as another customer entered. Georgia froze at the sound of a now familiar voice. Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy. I hope you've reconsidered my offer. Landon Pierce stood in the doorway, sunlight at his back, casting his face in shadow. His eyes found Georgia's immediately, as if he'd known she would be there. Morning, Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Abernathy replied, her tone cooler than it had been moments before. I'm afraid my answer remains the same. Pierce smiled, seemingly unbothered by the refusal. A pity. But perhaps Mr. Donovan has had time to reconsider. He turned his full attention to Georgia. I was just heading out to your property. Saved me the trip. finding you here. Georgia straightened, consciously broadening her shoulders. Answer's still no. Now if you'll excuse me. Mrs. Abernathy, I'll take my supplies and be on my way, Actually, Pierce said, blocking her path to the door. I was hoping we might speak privately. A business matter. There was no graceful way to refuse without seeming suspicious. Georgia nodded stiffly. After you, then. Outside, Pierce led her not to his carriage, but to the small alley beside the store. Once they were out of sight from the street, his demeanor changed, the polite businessman giving way to something more direct, more dangerous. I know who you are, he said without preamble. Or rather, who you aren't. Thomas Donovan died 4 months ago. You're his sister, Georgia. The world seemed to tilt beneath Georgia's feet, but she held her ground. You're mistaken. My sister's back east. Please, Pierce cut her off, impatience edging his voice. Your hands are too small, your neck too slender, and despite your best efforts, you walk like a woman accustomed to skirts. The only mystery is how you fooled this town for so long. A fear gave way to anger. Georgia stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. What do you want, Pierce? Money? The land? Or just the satisfaction of ruining me? Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps at her direct. What I want is to make a deal, one that benefits us both. I doubt that's possible. Hear me out before you decide. Pierce glanced toward the street, ensuring they remained unobserved. The territorial governor has granted the railroad permission to build a new spur line through this valley. Anyone controlling water access stands to make a considerable fortune. George's eyes narrowed. So you want our land for the railroad? I want a partnership, Pierce correct. Your land, my connections. We could build something substantial, a proper town, not just a whistle stop. But I need a business partner who can legally sign contracts, attend meetings. A man, you mean? Yes, his gaze was steady, unflinching. Or a woman willing to continue playing one. The implication stunned her. You're proposing I continue this deception? With you as an accomplice? I'm proposing a business arrangement that keeps you on your land and makes us both wealthy in the process. Pierce straightened his already immaculate cup. Unless you'd prefer, I speak with Judge Wilson about the fraud you've been perpetrating these past months. There it was, the threat beneath the offer. Georgia felt cold anger settle in her stomach. Blackmail doesn't become you, Mr. Pierce. Neither does desperation become you, Miss Donovan. Yet here we are. His voice softened fresh. Consider it carefully. I'll expect your answer tomorrow. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Georgia with the bitter taste of impossible choices. That night, Georgia sat at the kitchen table. Thomas's legal documents for her. Banknotes, the original homestead claim their grandfather had filed, all in the Donovan name, all requiring a man's signature to transfer or amend. The injustice of it burned like whiskey in her throat. Pierce's offer replayed in her mind. A partnership, continued deception, but with prosperity instead of mere survival as the reward. And the alternative? Exposure, humiliation, the loss of everything. She traced her fingers over Thomas's signature, the bold strokes she had learned to imitate. What choice did she really have? Pierce held all the cards, her secret, the law of the power of wealth and connection. If she refused, he would simply take what he wanted anyway. When she was exposed and the land seized, at dawn, Georgia donned her brother's best shirt and riding boots. She reached for his hat, then hesitated, staring at a reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman who looked back was thin, tired, her eyes too old for her 26 years. She had bent herself into the shape of Thomas for months now. How much more would this partnership with Pierce require her to bend before she broke entirely? The ride to town seemed longer than usual, each hoofbeat counting down the moments to a decision that would change her life, irrevocably. The morning air was crisp with early autumn, the fields rolling away like a patchwork quilt, stitched by generations of stubborn, hopeful hands. Pierce was waiting outside the land office, as if he'd known exactly when she would arrive. His carriage stood ready nearby, a silent reminder of his resources, his readiness to leave, with or without her cooperation. Georgia dismounted and approached him, her stride purposeful. I have conditions, she said without greeting. A smile touched the corner of Pierce's mouth. Good morning to you too, Miss Donovan. Mr. Donovan? She corrected, glancing meaningfully at a pair of women passing by. As far as anyone knows, that's who I remain. Pierce inclined his head. Of course. Shall we discuss these conditions somewhere more private? My room at the hotel, perhaps? Georgia almost laughed at the impropriety of it. A woman alone with a man in his hotel room would cause scandal enough, even without her current attire. The land office. Judge Wilson lets it for private business meetings. Inside the small office with its smell of paper and dust and men's decisions, Georgia laid out her terms. The land stays in the Donovan name. I maintain full control of the homestead and farming operations. You handle the railroad negotiations and any business requiring interaction with officials who might question my identity. Pierce listened, one eyebrow slightly raised. And the profits? The railroad will pay handsomely for water rights and crossing permissions. Split evenly, Georgia said firmly. And I want it in writing. A contract that protects me when our arrangement becomes known. When? Pierce seemed genuinely curious. You don't think we can maintain the deception indefinitely? Georgia met his gaze steadily. Nothing lasts indefinitely, Mr. Pierce. Not even lies told for the best of reasons. Something changed in his expression then. A softening, or perhaps just a reevaluation. You're not what I expected, Miss Donovan. A few women are what men expect, Mr. Pierce. That's why your laws try so hard to keep us in predictable places. She extended her hand man to man. Do we have an agreement? Pierce's hand closed around hers, warm and firm. We do. I'll have the papers drawn up by this afternoon. He held her hand a moment longer than necessary. This could be the beginning of something quite remarkable, you know. Georgia withdrew her hand, uncertain whether he meant the business venture or something more complicated. We'll see, Mr. Pierce. We'll see. As the autumn deepened into winter, the unlikely partnership between Georgia Donovan and Landon Pierce became the talk of Willow Creek, though not for the reasons either. Thomas Donovan remained a taciturn, hard-working farmer who now occasionally rode to town for business meetings. If anyone noticed that Pierce visited the Donovan homestead with increasing frequency, they attributed it to the railroad plans everyone now knew were coming. The deception should have grown harder with Pierce's constant presence, but strangely, it became easier. He created opportunities for Thomas to step away from conversations that might expose Georgia's limited knowledge of male topics. He intercepted questions that might reveal inconsistencies in her performance. Most surprisingly, he seemed to take genuine pleasure in watching her navigate her double life. You're getting better at this, he remarked one evening as they sat before the fire in her cabin. Maps of the proposed railroad route spread between them. That land dispute with Jenkins today, you handled it exactly as a man would. Georgia looked up from the maps, studying him in the firelight. I'm not sure that's a compliment. Pierce laughed, the sound unexpected and warm in the small room. Perhaps not, but it is an observation. You adapt, learn, apply. It's unnecessary, Georgia corrected, though something in his admiration warmed her more than the fire. Survival rarely leaves room for error. Is that all this is to you? Survival? Pierce set aside the maps, leaning forward. You could do more than survive, Georgia. This railroad will change everything. The town that grows here could be substantial, important. You could help shape it. That was the first time he had used her real name. The sound of it in his voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. As Thomas, you mean, not as myself. Pierce's gaze was thoughtful. For now, but laws change. Territories become states. Women in Wyoming already have voting rights. The world is moving forward, even if Willow Creek hasn't noticed yet. Georgia wanted to believe him, wanted to imagine a future where she could step out of Thomas's shadow and into her own life again. But hope was a luxury she'd denied herself since the day they'd buried her brother. Why do you care? She asked suddenly. About my future, I mean. You have what you wanted, the land deal, the railroad. Once the papers are signed, you don't need this partnership. You don't need me. Pierce was silent for a long moment, flames casting shadows across his features. Perhaps I've discovered that some things matter more than business contracts, he said finally. Perhaps I've come to admire the woman beneath the hat. Georgia felt heat rise to her cheeks, and it had nothing to do with Mr. Pierce. Landon, he corrected softly. After all this time, I think you could use my name. Landon, she conceded, the intimacy of it foreign on her tongue. This is complicated. His smile held a rueful edge. Extraordinarily so. A businessman conspiring with a woman disguised as her dead brother to circumvent property. While developing feelings he has no right to express, he shook his head. If it were a novel, no one would believe it. Feelings. The word hung in the air between them, impossible to ignore yet dangerous to acknowledge. Georgia stood abruptly, needing distance from the intensity of his gaze. It's getting late. The railroad representatives will be here early. Pierce recognized the dismissal for what it was. He gathered the maps carefully, his movements deliberate. At the door, he paused. Georgia, he said, his voice low. Whatever happens with the railroad, with the town, know that I see you. Not Thomas, you. After he left, Georgia stood motionless in the center of the cabin, her brother's clothes suddenly feeling like a costume rather than a necessity. To be seen, truly seen after months of hiding was both terrifying and exhilarating. But Pierce was right about the complications. Any feelings between them, any future would require unraveling a web of deception that grew more tangled with each passing day. The railroad representatives arrived the next morning, 3 men in expensive suits with the brisk efficiency of those accustomed to reshaping landscapes according to their vision. Georgia greeted them as Thomas, her disguise firmly back in place. Pierce arrived minutes later, the consummate businessman once more. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with Pierce handling most of the negotiations while Georgia provided occasional input about the land itself. The terms were generous, more so than she had dared hope. Water rights, crossing fees, options for future expansion, all carefully structured to benefit the Donovan property, while accommodating the railroad's needs. As the senior representative, a silver-haired man named Davidson, reviewed the final contract, he glanced up at Georgia with a puzzled expression. Mr. Donovan, forgive me, but didn't you have Georgia, I believe? Judge Wilson mentioned her when we spoke. Georgia felt Pierce tense beside her. She's back east, she replied smoothly. Family matters. Davidson nodded. Yes. It's just... Well, this is somewhat awkward, but there seems to be some confusion about the property deed. We have records indicating the land transferred to Georgia Donovan following your father's death, with you as co-owner. He shuffled through his papers. Yet all recent documents bear only your signature. The room seemed suddenly airless. Georgia fought to keep her expression neutral, even as panic clawed at her throat. There must be some mistake in your records, she managed. The land has always been in my name. A clerical error, no doubt, Pierce interjected smoothly. The territorial land records are notoriously disorganized. I can attest personally that Thomas Donovan is the legal owner of the property in question. Davidson appeared unconvinced. Nevertheless, we'll need to clarify this before proceeding. Railroad company can't risk complications with land titles. He closed the contract folder. Perhaps we could speak with Judge Wilson, or send a telegram to your sister to confirm the arrangement. Georgia's carefully constructed world teetered on the edge of collapse. A telegram would reveal that Georgia had never left Willow Creek. Judge Wilson would surely remember the details of the Donovan deed, especially with the discrepancy pointed out so directly. That won't be necessary, came a woman's voice from the doorway. Georgia turned, shock freezing her in place. In the open doorway stood a woman in a simple traveling dress, her hair pinned beneath a modest hat, her face an echo of Georgia's own, but softer, more feminine, unmistakably female. I'm Georgia Donovan, the woman said, stepping into the room with perfect composure. I returned from Boston last night. Forgive my interruption, but I couldn't help overhearing, and I'd be happy to clarify any questions about the property deed. The woman's gaze met Georgia's for the briefest moment, a silent message passing between them. Play along. Georgia stammered, her mind racing to understand what was happening. We weren't expecting you. Clearly, the woman replied with a small smile. But family business concluded sooner than anticipated. She turned to Davidson. Now about this deed confusion. As the woman, this impossible Georgia Donovan spoke confidently about property, transfers and territorial law. The real Georgia struggled to make sense of the situation. The stranger wore her name as comfortably as Georgia wore Thomas's clothes. She knew details about the Donovan family that only someone close to them would know. Pierce appeared equally stunned, though he recovered quickly, smoothly introducing himself to the newly returned Georgia Donovan and supporting her explanations to Davidson. The meeting concluded with renewed confidence from the railroad representatives. The contract signed, and witnessed, with promises that construction would begin in the spring. As the men departed, Davidson tipped his hat to both Donovans. "A pleasure doing business with you both. Miss Donovan, welcome home." When the carriage disappeared down the road, Georgia rounded on the stranger who had stolen her name. "Who are you? What do you think you're doing?" The woman's composure didn't waver. "Saving you, apparently. You're welcome." She glanced at Pierce. "I assume you're the reason Thomas here hasn't been exposed yet." Pierce nodded slowly. "I am. Though I'm at a disadvantage, it seems. You know who we are, but we don't know you." "Jessica Donovan," the woman said simply. "Thomas and Georgia's cousin from Philadelphia. Georgia wrote to me months ago, explaining the situation. I came as soon as I could arrange it." Georgia stared at her in disbelief. "I never wrote any letter. I don't even have a cousin, Jessica." "No," Jessica agreed. "But you have a brother named Thomas, who once saved my father's life during the war. When I read about Thomas's death in the Philadelphia paper, I wrote to express my condolences." She looked directly at Georgia. "The letter was returned with a hasty note explaining your predicament and asking for help. I never sent any." Georgia began, then understanding dawned. "Landon, you did this." Pierce had the grace to look slightly abashed. "After our conversation about the future, I realized we needed a solution that would allow you to be yourself again. Miss Donovan, Jessica seemed the perfect answer. A family connection, similar appearance, knowledge of your situation." But how did you know about her? About the connection to Thomas?" "I make it my business to know everything about potential business partners," Pierce replied, "including family connections, however distant." Jessica smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "He offered me a substantial sum to come play the role of Georgia Donovan while you transition back to being yourself. Quite an adventure for a spinster school teacher from Philadelphia." Georgia felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her again, but this time toward something solid rather than away from it. "You arranged all this without telling me? Decided my future without my consent?" "I created an opportunity," Pierce corrected gently. "Whether you take it is entirely your choice. You could continue as Thomas. Jessica could return east. Nothing need change if you don't wish it to." Georgia looked from Pierce to Jessica and back again. The immensity of what they were offering, freedom, identity, the chance to be herself again, was almost too much to comprehend. "And if I do wish to change, what then?" "Then Thomas gradually fades from public life as his health declines," Jessica suggested. "While Georgia returns, takes a more active role in the farm and the coming railroad business. Eventually, Thomas passes quietly, leaving his share of the property to his sister and cousin." "And no one questions it?" Georgia asked skeptically. "This convenient timing. People believe what makes sense to them," Pierce said. "A man dying of the same fever that nearly took him months ago. A devoted sister returning to care for him. These are familiar, believable narratives." Georgia gazed out the window at the land that had been worth so much deception, so much risk. Her land, soon to be transformed by progress, by the railroad, by the town that would grow around it. Pierce was offering her the chance to be part of that transformation as herself, not as a shadow of her brother. "It won't be easy," she said finally. "Becoming myself again. I've been Thomas for so long now." "Not so long," Pierce said softly. "Georgia Donovan has always been there beneath the hat, behind the plow, in every decision you've made to protect this place." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I've seen her all along." Jessica cleared her throat point. "Perhaps I should settle in. It seems we have planning to do, if we're to convince the good people of Willow Creek that I've returned from the east, while Thomas's health takes a turn for the worse." As Jessica busied herself with her traveling bags, Pierce took Georgia's hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses that matched her own. "I meant what I said last night. Whatever happens next, whatever you choose, I see you. And I would very much like the chance to know Georgia Donovan properly." For the first time in months, Georgia felt the weight of deception lifting from her shoulders. The future that opened before her was uncertain, complicated, filled with challenges, but it was hers to shape as herself. She squeezed Pierce's hand, a promise in the gesture. "I think," she said softly, "that Georgia Donovan would like that very much." As winter settled over Willow Creek, a new story unfolded. Thomas Donovan's health declined as the fever that had nearly claimed him months before returned with greater force. His sister Georgia, home from Boston, tended him alongside their cousin Jessica. And Landon Pierce, no longer just a businessman with his eye on valuable land, became a regular visitor to the Donovan homestead. His interest clearly personal, rather than professional. By spring, when the first railroad crews arrived to begin their work, Thomas Donovan was gone, but Georgia remained, standing tall in her own skin, on her own land, her hand occasionally finding Landon's as they watched the future arrive on iron tracks. No longer hidden beneath a hat, but seen, known, and loved exactly as herself.